So we have the pattern all complete now, and this is where it starts to get easy and I can really have some fun with it. The pattern takes a lot of technical detail and labeling and editing, and it's just not my favorite part. But now that we have the pattern done, I can start auditioning some fabrics and really see what I want to use in the actual quilt. So I have the finished pattern here, and right now it's mocked out in solids. Let's mock it up in some prints and just see what it looks like, see if we like it. I'm going to go in here and choose some new prints because I don't really like the ones that are just generically chosen. There's not a lot of variation. So I'm going to go choose some blues, and I'm just going to choose some random ones here. Actually, I don't really like those. Let's see if we can find some batiks, because I feel like prints, I don't want to do it in prints. If I'm going to do it in anything besides solids, it would be batiks. So let's just see what we can, oh, see there, that's better. But see, I'm not sure we're going to get the variety we need. And I need a lot of grays. Well, there's a couple there. So I'm just going to pick a bunch and we'll play with them. Let's see what we're looking like now. So the really cool thing with EQ8 is I can use the spray can tool and spray a color, and it'll spray all of the pieces of that color. So for this dark blue, it'll spray everything that is dark blue. And then I'm going to step down my colors. Now, I might not have gotten enough blues, but I think this is going to be the lightest blue. We'll just start here, and then I don't think that's the right shade. Let's go to our grays. I've got the light gray here. See, I'm just not loving that. It's just mottled. That's better. Let's work off of that one. I'm not falling in love with the prints or the batiks. Normally I love batiks, but I feel like this is such a realistic look that I really don't want to interrupt it with any prints. So I'm going to stick with solids. Let's go back to the original solids version. I really like that. So I'm going to use my color chart to pick out, I think 7 shades of blue and I think 4 shades of gray, but I have that all written out in the pattern. So I'll use the pattern to reference how many shades of the colors I need to pick out. I'll pick out my colors and then we'll get started sewing. I feel like the rendering of the pattern shows the lightest blue as darker than I actually want. So I'm going to start on this row, but I'm going to grab sky blue from the row below because I like how light a shade it is. Then I'll pick out all my other colors, land, water, grays, etc., and I'll write their color codes down so I don't forget what I've chosen. So these are my files where I keep all of my Robert Kaufman Kona solids. Every time I finish a legit kit, I have a lot of fabric left over, and they're all organized by the color code that legit uses, so I can consistently file them by that color code, and I just always have these fabrics on hand. I'm actually able to make this whole quilt with fabrics from this specific stash. So I use the color codes from the color chart that I just used, and I can come to these files and pull the colors, and some of them I might not have enough of, and then I can just choose the next closest color, or I might have to do some piecing within the pattern piece. We'll just see what I end up with in the end. But I really like that I can make good use of my leftover fabrics, especially the larger pieces. And I do a lot with solids. I'm just drawn to solids probably because I do so many legit kits, but I just like that I can use the solids. They're versatile. They're not one-sided, so I don't have to worry about right or wrong side, and that makes it really convenient for foundation paper piecing as well. These are the shades that I've chosen. I really like all of them except for the lighter colors. I feel like there's not enough difference between the 4 lightest shades, so I'm going to substitute a couple and play around with them until I get what I really like and am happy with the result in the end. Now we have all 40 something pages of the pattern printed out, and we need to paste them together because many of these pattern pieces span over several pattern pages. So I'm going to trim the corner off of 2 sides of the pattern so that I can line up the lines on each pattern. And I started out with glue. The glue was being a pain, so I swapped to tape at some point. But you just glue or tape the pattern pages together and make sure your lines stay straight. Take your time, and if something doesn't quite line up, you can reposition it. You have a little bit of work time with the glue, and then if you're using tape, it's the Scotch tape, so it'll come off pretty easily and you can reposition. So take your time and make sure everything stays nice and lined up and your lines are perfectly matched. There are quite a few large pieces to this pattern, so we just have to put them together before we can start sewing. And then I'll cut out the pattern pieces. Once everything's taped or glued together, you can cut them out roughly. I do not cut right on the seam allowance. Do not worry about being precise. The pattern comes with labels, so I'm going to use those to label my selection of blues and grays and all of my fabric so I can keep track of what is what. So the way I like to start cutting is just laying out all of my pattern pieces on top of the color that they will use. I like to do dark to light, so if a pattern piece calls for Sky 8 and Sky 7, I'll place it on the Sky 8, and then I'll cut all of the pattern pieces for Sky 8, and then I'll move them to Sky 7 if needed, or put them in the done pile, and I kind of work through all of the fabrics that way. And so I just get a bunch cut at the same time, and I cut everything out before I start sewing. And then we come to the good part, which is actually sewing this thing together. So if I'm just working through a bunch of pieces, I don't always press in between every single seam. Sometimes I just finger press, and especially on the smaller pieces, I don't need to be ironed every single time. But I just do kind of assembly line style. I won't even use a rotary cutter half the time. I just use scissors to trim off the extra. So if you've ever wanted to learn foundation paper piecing, I have a lot of tutorials and videos on my website and on YouTube. You can find me on any of the social media platforms by Cranky Kangaroo. So go find a tutorial, learn how to foundation paper piece, because it is my favorite technique. I will usually turn a traditional pattern into foundation paper piecing just to avoid traditional quilting. Sometimes in foundation paper piecing, you come to an odd angle that you struggle to get sewn correctly so that when you flip the fabric over, you're actually covering the pattern piece. So this last piece on this pattern here, it's not even an odd angle, but it's that my fabric does not match exactly the pattern piece. And so I want to make sure that I line everything up. So this is my trick for doing that. I will put the fabric on top of the pattern piece and then crease right on the sewing line. And then I can flip the fabric to the back of the pattern piece and line up the sewing line on the crease. You'll see me doing this several times with several different pattern pieces. I think if you've ever tried foundation paper piecing, you've had this problem where you flip your fabric open and it does not cover. This is a better example because that really is a weird angle. So just fold back right on that sewing line, give yourself a couple creases, and then I will also crease at the starting point so that I know exactly where on that fabric to place the pattern piece. And you just kind of have to peek behind it and line everything up. And then once you sew it, you know it's good to go because you've marked it before you sewed it. You can also use pins. So if you think you have it lined up, put a pin right on that sewing line, just like you're going to pretend to sew it. And that way you can flip your fabric before you sew, before you trim, and check to make sure everything lines up and everything is in the right position. Then you can remove your pins, sew, trim, iron, and you should be in the right position. On a lot of these pieces, you might notice that I'm using quite large pieces of fabric. There's a couple reasons for this. One, I'm pulling from what is essentially scraps in my stash. So if I just had a small piece that roughly fit the pattern, I'm just going to put it with a pattern and sew it and trim off the extra. I'm not worrying about really cutting it to the exact shape of that pattern size. And then two, I actually use my scraps, my cutoffs. So if you saw the Fall Grace Festival, you saw my project where I use up all of my scraps. And so I have a really fun project for that. And so I just don't worry about waste. The other thing too is these are Robert Kaufman Kona solids. They're one of the very few OTEX certified fabrics. So you could even put them in your compost if you're just really worried about putting them in the trash. Put them in your compost. They'll deteriorate over time without adding harmful chemicals to your yard. So there's lots of ways to use up your scrap. And for me, time is money. I would much rather just throw the fabric onto the pattern and trim off the extra and not worry about how much waste I have. Once I have all of the fabric sewn onto the pattern pieces, I will trim them on the seam allowance. Now, one of the things I really like about the True Cut ruler is that you can work around pins because it's got this nice open grid to it. So I can just put the pin head in between the grids, and then instead of like with a regular acrylic ruler that would shift and slide and be very dangerous if you have pins on your fabric, this I can work around and really be able to still use pins to hold the fabric to the paper piece. Now, I do sometimes use tape. I'll just use the same Scotch tape that I use to put the pattern pages together. I'll use that in between the fabric and the paper. I'll double the tape over on itself, and that will hold the paper to the fabric as well. For the smaller pieces, I actually use a rotating cutting board, and this is nothing more than a cheap Lazy Susan, like what you would use in your pantry to organize your spices. And then I've glued a piece of wood and then a mat on top of it. I probably used like a scrap mat that was bad in some places, and I just cut it the size of the Lazy Susan. I just finished all my pieces and they're trimmed. So I get to put them together now. I'm so excited. I was really stressed about getting this done in time, and it is 3:30. I started sewing these pieces this morning and I'm done sewing them. So let's finish our quilt. When you're putting your sections together, there's a couple things to keep in mind. You can line them up just by matching the endpoints. Be careful with this because sometimes they can shift, or with these really sharp angles, sometimes it's deceptive, like where they're really supposed to line up. But as soon as I sew the seams, I will remove the paper from the seam allowance. I leave the paper on everywhere else. If it has like a label on it, a number, a letter, a section name, a color name, I will leave that paper on until the very end, but I will remove it from the seam allowances. And this makes ironing much easier because nothing will get caught underneath your seam allowances. So you can also use a pin and point method where you put a pin into one end point and up through the corresponding end point, and do that at both ends of the pattern pieces, and then pin right on that sewing line. That way you make sure that you're really getting your end points lined up and everything will match across that seam. And then again, remove paper from the seam allowances and give it a good press. I will try and press open if I can, but sometimes the fabric tells you it does not want to be pressed open. It wants to be pressed to one side or another. So listen to your fabric, and once you get all of your sections together, you can give it a good press and remove all of your paper then. I stayed up late last night to finish this, and I am so in love. Let me show you. I'm so excited. I love it. I think the reflection turned out even better than I expected because I wasn't sure about the pink, but sometimes you just have to go with it. But I think that pink works really well there. The green, actually I changed from my original choice because I didn't have enough of my original choice. So now I'm going to quilt it in part 3.